It was a quiet evening in a suburban neighborhood with the sun just dipping below the horizon. The streets were mostly empty, save for the occasional car passing by, their headlights cutting through the fading light. The air felt cool, a crispness that hinted at the arrival of nightfall. As the streets began to grow darker, one car caught the attention of a nearby police officer. A sleek, black sports car rolled down the street, its powerful engine purring softly as it cruised through the quiet residential area. The car's polished exterior gleamed under the streetlights, drawing the officer's eyes immediately. It wasn't the kind of vehicle that typically belonged in this area. The officer had seen it before, parked on the outskirts of town, but never in a place like this. The officer, standing beside his patrol car, narrowed his eyes. He didn't need much to make a judgment. The car was expensive, too flashy for someone living in a neighborhood like this. He wondered briefly who could afford such a luxury. As the car got closer, he quickly formed an assumption in his mind: someone driving a car like that, especially in this part of town, must be involved in something shady. Maybe drugs. Maybe some kind of illegal business. His grip tightened on the steering wheel of his patrol car as the sports car passed him by. Without a second thought, he flipped on his lights and made a sharp U-turn, following the car's path down the road. The driver didn't seem to notice at first, but the officer, his judgment clouded by bias, felt a rush of satisfaction. This was going to be a routine stop, or so he thought. He pulled up behind the car, the bright blue lights flashing in the rearview mirror, and slowed to a stop. A quick glance at the license plate, a few more seconds of watching the car in his mirror, and the officer's mind was already made up. This was no ordinary stop. He had a suspect on his hands, and as the black sports car came to a halt, the officer's initial suspicion began to boil into certainty. The officer stepped out of his patrol car, his boots making a heavy thud against the pavement. He straightened his uniform, adjusted his belt, and began walking toward the sleek sports car. The bright headlights of his vehicle cast long shadows across the street as he approached. His expression was serious, eyes narrowed, and his mind already made up. He had a feeling, an instinct, that told him this man was up to something. As he reached the driver's side window, the officer didn't waste time with pleasantries. Without even a hello, he immediately demanded license and registration. Now, the man behind the wheel, a tall, well-dressed black man in his early 30s, didn't seem startled by the sudden demand. He kept his hands visible on the steering wheel, his posture calm. But there was something about the way he held himself that suggested he was used to this kind of treatment. He slowly reached for his glove compartment. The officer, noticing the hesitation in the man's movements, immediately took it as an opportunity to assert control. "What are you doing around here?" he asked, his tone dripping with suspicion. "This isn't the type of neighborhood where people like you would normally be driving a car like that." The man's fingers paused on the glove compartment latch. His eyes met the officer's through the window, steady and unflinching. The officer's judgment was already clouded. He glanced at the car: expensive, luxurious, out of place. "Where'd you get the money for this car? You got a job? Or is this all part of some deal you're running?" His voice rose a little, his words now thick with accusation. The black man didn't flinch. He slowly pulled out his license and registration, placing them on the dashboard for the officer to inspect. His voice, when he spoke, was calm and controlled. "I'm just passing through. I live a few miles from here," he said, his tone polite but firm. "I've worked hard for this car, and I don't appreciate being questioned like this." The officer's eyes narrowed further. "Yeah, well, people don't just drive cars like that without some kind of connection to something illegal," he retorted, his words carrying the weight of an assumption he wasn't willing to let go of. "You sure you're not involved in something you shouldn't be?" The man's eyes didn't waver. "I'm sure," he replied coolly, though there was an undeniable edge to his voice now. He could feel the tension rising, but he refused to let his calm slip. "I've done nothing wrong. I don't know what your problem is, but you're judging me based on my car and my skin color, and that's not okay." The officer stepped back slightly, momentarily thrown by the man's composed response. But it was clear the officer wasn't done. He couldn't let go of the image of the fancy car and the man sitting in it. His own biases pushed him forward. "You don't get to tell me how to do my job," the officer barked, his voice growing louder. "You're in a nice car in a neighborhood like this, so something's not adding up. Don't think I don't know what I'm looking at." He was digging in now, unwilling to let go of the preconceived narrative he'd built. But the man, with a deep breath, held up his hand. "I'm not going to argue with you. I just want to be on my way. But I want to make something clear: you're wrong about me." The officer stood there, eyes still locked on the man, trying to find something else to challenge. But there was a steady, unwavering calm in the black man's voice and demeanor, that made it harder to continue his line of questioning. The officer hesitated, unsure of how to respond. He was used to making people nervous, getting them to crack under pressure, but this man didn't seem fazed. The silence between them stretched for a moment. It was as if time slowed down. Then, just as the officer opened his mouth to speak again, something changed. The silence lingered between them, thick and heavy. The officer's mind raced as he tried to find the right words, the right way to get the man to crack. He couldn't admit he was wrong, not yet. There had to be something about this man's story that didn't add up, something that would confirm his suspicions. His grip on his flashlight tightened, the cool metal a reminder of the power he thought he had in this situation. The man in the sports car was still calm, still composed. His gaze remained steady, almost unfazed by the officer's interrogation. The more the officer pushed, the more this man seemed to rise above it. It was as though the man was no longer just a suspect. The officer could sense something different about him now. But his own pride and prejudice blinded him from understanding the truth. Finally, with a slow exhale, the man spoke again, his voice calm but now carrying an undeniable authority. "You've made a lot of assumptions about me tonight," he began, pausing as if weighing his words carefully. "I think it's time I tell you something." The officer's brow furrowed. He'd heard enough. He was ready to wrap this up, to finally find the one thing that would justify his assumptions. But the man wasn't done. The words that followed made the officer's heart skip a beat. "I'm your new boss," the man said, his tone unwavering. The officer froze. For a moment, everything seemed to stop. His mind struggled to process what had just been said. The words echoed in his head, a flash of disbelief washing over him. His mouth went dry, his grip on the flashlight loosening, and his eyes widened in shock. "What?" The word came out barely above a whisper. His voice cracked, and for the first time that night he found himself at a loss for words. "I said," the man repeated slowly, his voice still composed but now carrying a sense of finality, "I'm your new boss. I was just appointed as a high-ranking officer in the police department." The officer blinked, staring at the man in front of him as if trying to make sense of the situation. His mind raced through all the possibilities, all the excuses he could offer to explain away the embarrassment creeping up his neck. But there was no explanation, no easy way out. He had judged this man wrongly, thoroughly, and now, the truth hit him like a freight train. The man leaned slightly forward in his seat, his hands still calmly resting on the steering wheel. His expression softened just enough to show he wasn't interested in making the officer feel worse than he already did. "I don't know if you've heard, but I was just appointed as one of the senior officers in the department. I'm your superior now." The officer's face flushed. He could feel his heart racing, the weight of his mistake crashing down on him. His pulse quickened as he tried to regain his composure, but it was too late. The realization was too sudden, too jarring. The man he had assumed was involved in illegal activity, the man he had judged based on nothing more than his race and the car he drove, was now in a position of power over him. An overwhelming wave of embarrassment swept through the officer, but he fought it back, desperate to maintain control. This can't be right," he muttered, his voice a mixture of disbelief and panic. He shifted his stance, trying to steady his hands as they clenched around his flashlight. I didn't know. I didn't think you did," the black man interrupted calmly, his voice surprisingly forgiving. "But now you know." The officer shifted uncomfortably on his feet. His face was red, his body tense, his thoughts scattered. How could he have been so blind? How could he have assumed this man, this highly respected officer, was just some criminal based on a car and the color of his skin? The truth felt like a slap in the face, and the cop struggled to reconcile it with the narrative he had built in his mind. His bias had been so strong, his assumptions so ingrained, that he couldn't see past them. Now, faced with the undeniable truth, he felt small, exposed, and vulnerable. The officer took a shaky breath and forced himself to look the man in the eyes. I didn't mean to offend you," he stammered, his words coming out with an edge of panic. "I was just doing my job. I thought you thought I was guilty based on my car, my skin color, and nothing more," the man finished for him, his voice firm now, no longer laced with kindness. "I get it. But you're wrong. And that's the problem." The officer's face tightened, his discomfort now turning into something more. He knew he had to salvage the situation, but his pride kept him from apologizing fully. Instead, he tried to explain, to justify his actions, but every word seemed hollow. The man's calm, unshaken demeanor only made him feel worse. "I'm not here to cause trouble," the black man continued, his tone still controlled. "But you need to understand something. The world is changing, and so is this department. We're here to serve and protect, not to judge based on the color of someone's skin or the car they drive. If you want to be part of that change, you're going to have to learn how to do better." The officer stood there, speechless. The internal conflict was clear on his face, pride, shame, and fear battling within him. He had been so sure of his assumptions, so confident in his biases, but now he was face to face with the truth. And it was more than he could bear to accept. The officer stood there, hands still gripping the flashlight, his body stiff with discomfort. He could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on him. Every word the man had said echoed in his mind, and the realization of his mistake cut through him like a knife. But he wasn't ready to face the truth just yet. His instinct was to apologize, to explain himself, but there was something about the calmness of the man that made him hesitate. For a long moment, the black man sat there, his hands resting on the steering wheel. He was silent, almost as if he were giving the officer time to process the situation, to understand the gravity of the moment. The officer shifted on his feet, awkwardly glancing at the ground, at the pavement, at anything but the man in the driver's seat. He could feel the man's gaze on him, steady, unwavering, and it only made him feel smaller. Finally, the man spoke, his voice gentle but firm, cutting through the officer's self-imposed silence. "You know," he began, his tone not laced with anger or hostility, but with something far more powerful, understanding. "I'm not angry with you, officer. I don't have time for anger. What I do have time for is talking about what just happened here." He paused, glancing briefly at the patrol car before meeting the officer's eyes again. "And what happened here was that you judged me based on nothing but my appearance, and that's a problem. It's a problem that goes beyond you and me. It's a problem that we all need to face." The officer opened his mouth, but no words came out. He was at a loss. He couldn't argue with the truth in the man's words. The man had every right to be angry, to lash out, but instead he chose a different path. A path that was teaching the officer something far more valuable than any reprimand could. The man continued, his voice calm and controlled. "I've been stopped by officers before. I've been treated like a criminal because of the way I look, because of the car I drive. And I know I'm not the only one. But here's the thing, this kind of treatment doesn't just hurt the person on the receiving end. It hurts everyone. It hurts the community. It hurts the integrity of this department. And it certainly hurts the person who's doing the judging." The officer shifted again, unsure how to respond. The man's words were like a mirror, forcing him to see himself in a light he wasn't prepared for. It was easier to blame others, to convince himself that he was justified. But now there was no escaping the truth. The officer had allowed his biases to cloud his judgment, and now, standing in front of a man who was his superior, he had to face it. "I'm sorry," the officer finally muttered, his voice barely audible. "I didn't mean to," but the man cut him off, his voice unwavering. "An apology isn't enough. Not this time." The officer froze. He didn't expect that response. He thought an apology would make it all better. But this man, his superior, was teaching him a lesson far deeper than any apology could fix. He had been wrong, and no amount of words could erase the harm he had done. "It's not just about saying sorry," the man explained, his eyes steady. "It's about understanding why you did what you did and making sure you don't do it again. An apology doesn't change the fact that you saw me as a criminal before you even knew who I was. And that's the issue here. The fact that you didn't see me as an individual, but as a stereotype. That's what needs to change." The officer felt his chest tighten, a feeling he wasn't used to. It was guilt, a deep, gnawing guilt that made him realize just how much he had allowed his biases to shape his actions. He wasn't used to this kind of confrontation. He was used to being in control, used to making the rules, and now, he was the one being taught a lesson. The black man continued, his voice still calm but carrying a weight that the officer couldn't ignore. "We all have biases, every single one of us, but it's what we do with them that matters. It's about taking responsibility for how we treat others, especially in a job like mine, where people depend on you to do what's right. Where we're supposed to be protecting people, not judging them." The officer nodded slowly, unable to respond at first. He wanted to apologize again, but the words felt hollow. This wasn't just about saying sorry. It was about something deeper. It was about the system, about how racism and prejudice had seeped into places they shouldn't have. And it wasn't just about this one interaction. It was about a culture that needed to change. "Look," the man said, leaning back in his seat just slightly, "I'm not here to ruin your life. I'm not here to take your job. But what I am here for is this change. Change in how we see each other. Change in how we treat each other. We can't let this continue, officer. We can't keep going down the same path." The officer took a long, shaky breath. For the first time he was starting to understand. He wasn't just facing the consequences of his actions in this moment. He was facing the reality of what those actions represented. The way they fit into a much larger problem, one that stretched far beyond this one traffic stop. "I understand," the officer said, finally finding his voice. "I understand now, and I'll do better. I don't want to be part of the problem." The man's gaze softened, though the seriousness in his eyes remained. "That's the first step," he said, nodding slightly. "It's not about being perfect. It's about recognizing our mistakes, learning from them, and committing to doing better." There was a brief pause as the two men stood in silence, the tension in the air now starting to dissipate. The officer still felt uncomfortable, but there was something else there now too, a recognition of the responsibility he carried, both as an individual and as part of the larger system. The weight of it was heavy, but it wasn't something he could ignore anymore. "I appreciate you taking the time to explain this," the officer said quietly, his voice steady now. "I really do." The man nodded, a slight smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "It's not just about explaining. It's about listening. That's the hardest part, officer." The tension between them hung in the air, but there was something different now. The officer stood still, his hands at his sides, his gaze lowered to the ground, a look of deep contemplation crossing his face. He had been on autopilot for so long, his actions guided by assumptions and prejudice, but now everything was different. The conversation with the black man had shaken him in a way he hadn't anticipated. It was uncomfortable, yes, but it was necessary. The officer swallowed, trying to steady his breath. It was hard to admit to himself that he had been wrong, that he had let bias and assumptions rule his actions. He had prided himself on doing his job, but now he realized that his actions that night were not only a failure of judgment, they were a failure of character. And that wasn't something he could ignore. After what felt like an eternity of silence, the officer finally spoke. His voice was low, but it carried with it a weight of sincerity that had been missing earlier. I owe you an apology," he began, his words measured but genuine. "I've been thinking about everything you said, and I see now that I was wrong. I shouldn't have judged you like that. I let my assumptions and my own prejudices guide my actions, and that's not the kind of officer I want to be. That's not the kind of person I want to be." He paused, taking a deep breath, feeling the sting of regret settle in his chest. The man in the car remained silent, watching him intently, but with a calm expression that didn't seem angry, just expectant. He waited for the officer to say what needed to be said. "I know my behavior reflects poorly on me, and worse, it reflects poorly on the department I represent," the officer continued. "I've failed to uphold the values I swore to protect, and for that, I'm truly sorry." The words were hard to say, but they felt right. Apologizing wasn't easy, it wasn't a quick fix, nor did it erase the damage that had been done. But it was a start. And that's what the officer needed, a chance to begin again, to learn, and to do better. The black man in the driver's seat didn't say anything immediately. Instead, he nodded slowly, as if processing the officer's apology. Then, after a long moment, he spoke again, his voice calm but filled with a quiet strength that seemed to emanate from him. "Apology accepted," he said. "But let me tell you something that goes beyond just saying sorry." The officer looked up at him, his eyes filled with curiosity. The man's voice had a wisdom to it that the officer couldn't ignore. "Being an officer means being a leader," the man continued. "But leadership isn't about power, it's about example. It's about showing others how to act, how to treat people. And more than anything, it's about understanding that every single person you encounter is a human being. Not a stereotype, not a criminal, just a person with their own story. That's the first step to real leadership." The officer nodded slowly, absorbing the man's words. He had heard things like this before, but hearing them now, after the events of the evening, felt different. It felt real. He had always believed in the concept of protecting and serving, but now he realized that true service wasn't just about enforcing the law, it was about serving the community, building trust, and treating everyone with dignity and respect. "The hardest part of leadership is recognizing your flaws," the black man continued. "We all have them. We all make mistakes. But what matters is how we choose to move forward. How we choose to learn from those mistakes. And that's what I want you to take from this conversation. This isn't about me. It's about you. It's about how you decide to do better, to be better. Not just for yourself, but for the people you serve." The officer stood there, listening intently. The words hit him hard, but in the best way possible. He had never really thought about leadership in this way before, not in the context of personal growth and self-reflection. But now he understood. He wasn't just a cog in the machine. He had the power to make a difference. It wasn't going to be easy, but it was possible. And that possibility started with him. I hear you, the officer said, his voice firm now, a sense of resolve building within him. And you're right. I have to do better. I will do better. The black man smiled slightly, a faint glimmer of approval in his eyes. That's all anyone can ask for. Just take it one step at a time. Change doesn't happen overnight, but it starts with the decision to make it happen. There was another brief silence, but it wasn't uncomfortable anymore. It was the kind of silence that comes after an important conversation. The kind that signals understanding. The kind that signifies a shift. The officer felt lighter somehow, as though the weight he had carried on his shoulders for so long had lessened, even if just a little. The black man shifted in his seat, preparing to leave. I've got a long night ahead of me. But I hope you remember this moment, he said as he reached for the gear shift. Remember that it's not just about wearing a badge. It's about living up to what that badge represents. You've got a lot of work to do, officer. But you can do it. And I'll be watching. The officer didn't respond immediately. He just nodded, his mind racing with everything the man had shared. There was no way to undo the past, but there was a way to move forward. And that was all that mattered now. As the man drove away, the officer stood there, watching the sports car disappear into the night. It felt like the end of something, a chapter closing, but also the beginning of something new. Something better. The officer turned back toward his patrol car, his hand on the door. He knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but for the first time in a long while, he felt ready to face it. He knew that change didn't just happen outside, it had to start within. And that was exactly where he was going to begin. The man walked away from the patrol car with a quiet confidence, his steps deliberate and calm. He didn't look back as he made his way to the sleek sports car that had caused all this tension. The officer stood there, frozen in place for a moment, his eyes following the man's every move. The contrast between them was stark, one walking away with purpose, unfazed by the encounter, and the other still standing, his posture slumped in embarrassment, grappling with the weight of his actions. It was as if the entire night had shifted in an instant, and the officer was left to face the truth he had been avoiding for so long. The man reached his car and paused, turning his head just enough to glance back at the officer, his expression unreadable but calm. Without a word, he got into the car and drove off into the night, leaving the officer standing alone in the quiet suburban street. The scene lingered in the officer's mind, the silence surrounding him almost deafening. It wasn't just about the traffic stop anymore, it was about something much deeper. The officer's reflection on his actions wasn't about self-pity or justification, it was about understanding the larger issue at play. It was about the biases and prejudices that had shaped his worldview and how, in that moment, he had allowed those biases to control his judgment. Racism and prejudice don't just affect individuals, they affect entire systems, but change is possible. Every day, in small ways, we can challenge those biases, whether it's in our personal lives, at work, or in professional environments like law enforcement. The key is self-awareness, open-mindedness, and the willingness to do better. If you believe in fairness, equality, and fighting against discrimination, take a moment to like, share, and comment. Let's continue this conversation. Share your thoughts below. Together, we can make a difference. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories that inspire change.